He had learned very early how to survive, but no one had taught him how to live. His days passed in silence, measured by obligations, expectations, and the quiet ache in his chest that he never allowed himself to name. From the outside, his life looked complete. Respect, stability, a future carefully built brick by brick. Yet every night, when the lights went out, he felt the same emptiness pressing against his ribs, as if something essential had been forgotten along the way. He told himself that this was adulthood, that dreams were childish things, and that happiness was a luxury meant for others. Then one ordinary evening changed everything. He met her by accident, in a place where people usually rushed past one another without seeing anything at all. She was laughing, truly laughing, the kind of sound that interrupts your thoughts and makes you turn around without knowing why. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, yet something in her eyes felt like recognition, as if she saw not the man he pretended to be, but the one he had buried deep inside. Their first conversation was simple, almost awkward, but when they said goodbye, he realized his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Days turned into conversations, conversations into long walks, and long walks into confessions whispered under quiet skies. With her, he spoke about his fears, his failures, the dreams he had abandoned out of fear of disappointment. She listened without trying to fix him, without judgment, as if his broken pieces were not flaws but proof that he had lived. For the first time, he felt allowed to be incomplete. For the first time, he felt chosen. But happiness never comes without a test. Life, as if jealous of their peace, began to pull them apart. Responsibilities demanded his attention, old wounds resurfaced, and fear crept back into his heart, whispering that he was not enough, that love like this could not last. One night, in a moment of weakness, he let those fears speak louder than his love, and he walked away, convincing himself that leaving would hurt less than staying and losing everything. The silence that followed was unbearable. The world returned to its grey rhythm, colder than before. Success meant nothing, mornings felt heavy, and every place reminded him of her absence. Only then did he understand the truth he had been running from. Love was not the thing that made him weak, it was the thing that made him real. Losing her was not safety, it was the deepest pain he had ever known. So he did the bravest thing of his life. He returned, not with excuses, but with honesty. He admitted his fear, his mistakes, his longing. He stood before her without armor, ready to be rejected, ready to lose her again, but unwilling to live another day in regret. And she, with tears in her eyes and strength in her voice, chose forgiveness. Not because he was perfect, but because love, when it is true, recognizes effort, growth, and courage. They did not promise each other a perfect life. They promised honesty, patience, and the willingness to choose one another every single day. And in that choice, in that shared courage, he finally found what he had been missing all along. Not just love, but a home in another human heart. Years passed, but their love did not fade into habit. It deepened, changed, learned to breathe through difficulties and to celebrate the smallest victories. They faced ordinary problems, tired evenings, misunderstandings, moments when words failed, but now they knew one important truth. Love was not the absence of pain, it was the decision to stay even when things were hard. Every argument ended not with distance, but with quieter voices and hands finding each other again, reminding them that they were on the same side. There were nights when fear still visited him, old shadows knocking softly at his thoughts. But this time he did not face them alone. She became his calm, the place where his heart could rest without pretending to be strong. And he became her shelter in return, the one who listened when the world felt too loud, who believed in her even when she doubted herself. Together, they learned that love grows not from perfection, but from mutual care and patience. One day, standing in the gentle light of a new morning, he understood something profound. Happiness was not a sudden miracle or a dramatic moment. It was built quietly, day by day, in shared breakfasts, in tired smiles, in the way they held hands without thinking about it. The emptiness that once defined him had disappeared, replaced by a sense of meaning that felt steady and real. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. And when life tested them again, as it always does, they faced it side by side, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. Their story did not end with a perfect fairy tale, but with something far more powerful. A love that endured, healed, and chose hope every single time that then fate struck again, without warning, as it often does when life seems finally calm. One evening, in the middle of laughter and unfinished plans, everything stopped. A single phone call shattered the air between them, its words sharp and merciless. Illness. Sudden. Serious. The kind of word that steals the future right out of your hands. The walls of their world trembled, and fear returned, not as a whisper this time, but as a scream. Hospitals became their second home. The smell of antiseptic, the endless waiting, the cruel rhythm of machines measuring time in beeps and breaths. He sat beside her bed for hours, holding her hand, afraid to let go even for a moment, as if his grip alone could keep her anchored to this world. She grew weaker, but her eyes still searched for him every time she woke, and in that fragile gaze was a strength that broke his heart and healed it at the same time. There were nights when he cried silently in empty corridors, pressing his fist to his mouth so no one would hear the sound of a man begging the universe for mercy. He blamed himself for every past mistake, every moment of fear, every second he had once wasted running from love. He promised everything, to change, to be better, to never take a single breath beside her for granted again, if only fate would give them one more chance. And then, in the quietest hour before dawn, when hope felt almost cruel, something changed. Her fingers tightened around his. A small movement. A sign of return. Tears blurred his vision as doctors spoke words he had been too afraid to hear. Improvement. Recovery. Time. It was not a miracle, but it was enough. Enough to breathe again. Enough to believe. Recovery was slow and painful, filled with setbacks and exhaustion, but they faced it together. Each step she took felt like a victory over darkness itself. Each smile was a rebellion against fear. He learned a new kind of love then, not the romantic fire of beginnings, but the fierce, protective devotion that stands guard when everything is at risk. He loved her not only for who she was, but for every battle she fought to stay. When she finally walked out into the sunlight again, thinner but alive, the world looked different. Colors seemed brighter. Sounds felt louder. Life, once taken for granted, became sacred. He realized that love had not only saved her, it had saved him too. It had taught him courage, humility, and the unbearable beauty of hope. And standing there, with her hand in his and tears still fresh on both their faces, he knew with absolute certainty. No matter what storms awaited them, no matter how fragile happiness could be, this was the ending worth every scar. A love that survived the darkness and chose life. Time continued its quiet march forward, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It became a gift. Every morning they woke up together felt earned, almost sacred, as if the universe had allowed them a secret it didn't give to everyone. They learned to slow down, to notice the warmth of sunlight on the wall, the sound of rain against the windows, the comfort of shared silence. What once seemed ordinary now felt extraordinary. Yet healing was not only physical. Some nights she woke up trembling, memories of pain and fear pulling her back into darkness. And some nights he sat on the edge of the bed, haunted by the thought of how close he had come to losing her. In those moments, they held each other tightly, not speaking, letting their heartbeats remind them that they were still here. Still together. Still alive. One evening, when the sky burned with colors of gold and deep red, he took her back to the place where they had first met. The world moved around them, people passing by just as they once had, unaware that something life-changing had begun right there. His hand shook, not from fear this time, but from emotion, as he told her how she had saved him, how loving her had taught him to be brave, how life without her was no longer imaginable. He did not promise her an easy future. He promised presence. He promised honesty on the hardest days and laughter on the lighter ones. He promised that if darkness ever returned, he would face it with her, never ahead of her, never behind her, but always by her side. And when he asked her to choose him, not as a perfect man but as a real one, her answer came through tears and a smile that held every battle they had survived. They built their life slowly, carefully, like something precious that could still break if handled carelessly. Love became visible in the smallest details. A cup of tea left on the table, a jacket placed over tired shoulders, a glance that said "I'm here" without words. The world still had its cruelty, its uncertainty, its storms, but it no longer felt unbearable. Because they had learned the truth most people discover too late. Happiness is not the absence of suffering, but the courage to love after it. And as they walked forward together, carrying both scars and hope, their story did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like a beginning that had finally earned the right to exist. And then life offered them something they had never dared to ask for, as if rewarding their endurance with a fragile miracle. One quiet afternoon, in the soft light of an ordinary room, she looked at him with eyes filled with disbelief and trembling joy and whispered words that changed the shape of his world forever. New life. A heartbeat not yet heard, but already deeply felt. Hope, small and powerful, had found its way back into their hands. Fear returned for a moment. How could it not? After everything they had survived, the thought of losing again felt unbearable. But this time fear did not rule them. It stood in the corner, watched, and slowly lost its power. They chose faith over panic, tenderness over anxiety. He spoke to her growing belly as if the child could already understand, promising safety, love, and a world where courage mattered more than perfection. Months passed in careful joy. Every doctor's visit, every reassuring smile, every quiet kick in the night felt like a victory written in flesh and breath. She grew stronger, her laughter returning, fuller and warmer than before. And he, watching her, realized that love had transformed him completely. The man who once ran from feeling now stood ready to protect a future he could barely believe was real. The day their child was born, time seemed to stop. In that first cry, raw and undeniable, he felt something break open inside him. Every fear, every regret, every scar dissolving into pure, overwhelming love. He held that tiny life in his arms and understood, with a clarity that stole his breath, that everything they had endured had led them here. To this moment. To this proof that light can grow even in the aftermath of darkness. Years later, they would tell their story in quiet fragments, never glorifying the pain, never hiding the truth. They would teach their child that love is not always gentle, but it is always worth choosing. That strength is not the absence of tears, but the courage to keep going while they fall. And on ordinary evenings, when the house was filled with soft voices and shared warmth, he would look at the life they had built and feel something deeper than happiness. Gratitude. For the pain that taught him meaning. For the love that refused to leave. For an ending that did not close a story, but opened it into something infinite. As the child grew, so did their understanding of what love truly meant. It was no longer only about passion or survival, but about responsibility, patience, and showing up even when you were exhausted to the bone. Sleepless nights returned, but they were different now, filled with soft crying, whispered lullabies, and the quiet teamwork of two people who had learned how fragile and precious life could be. There were moments when he watched her with their child and felt his chest tighten with emotion so strong it almost hurt. He remembered the hospital rooms, the fear, the uncertainty, and it felt unreal that the same hands that once trembled with weakness now held a future so confidently. She had become stronger than her pain, and he had become braver than his past. Together, they were more than they had ever been apart. Of course, life did not suddenly become perfect. There were days when money was tight, when exhaustion turned small misunderstandings into sharp words, when old fears tried to resurface. But now they knew how to fight, not against each other, but against the silence, against distance, against the temptation to give up. Every conflict ended with truth, with apologies, with the quiet decision to choose love again. One night, long after the child had fallen asleep, they sat together in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of peaceful breathing from the next room. He took her hand and realized that this simple moment, was everything he had once believed he didn't deserve. Not a dramatic victory, not applause or recognition, but a life filled with meaning, built from pain and healed by love. She rested her head on his shoulder, and in that gesture was every chapter they had lived through. The loneliness, the fear, the waiting, the miracle of staying. He understood then that happiness was not loud. It did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, when you were brave enough to keep going, and stayed only if you were gentle enough to protect it. And so their story continued, not as a perfect fairy tale, but as something far more real. A story of two people who had walked through darkness, held on when it would have been easier to let go, and discovered that the strongest love is the one that survives, grows, and chooses hope, again and again, for a lifetime. Years turned into decades, and the world changed around them, but the bond they had forged in fire and fear only deepened. Their child grew into a person full of curiosity, laughter, and wonder, carrying with them the lessons of resilience, courage, and love that had been hard-earned. Every milestone, first steps, first words, first achievements, was celebrated not just for the joy it brought, but for the proof that life could flourish even after darkness. They themselves changed too. The man who once counted his life in empty accomplishments now measured it in moments. The curve of her smile in morning light, the warmth of a hand pressed gently over his, the shared quiet after a long day when no words were needed. He had learned that love was not a dramatic gesture or a perfect ending, but the accumulation of tiny choices. Patience, kindness, forgiveness, and the courage to be vulnerable every single day. And she, once fragile in the shadow of illness and fear, had grown into a partner whose strength was quiet but unshakable, whose laughter could still fill a room with hope, and whose heart had never stopped believing in second chances. Life, inevitably, tested them still. Challenges arrived, illnesses, setbacks, the pressures of time and aging, but none were insurmountable because they faced them as one. Together, they had built a fortress not of stone, but of trust, compassion, and unwavering commitment. Each trial they endured strengthened the bond that had begun in chance and survived calamity. Each fear faced together became a victory of love over despair. One spring evening, when the sky was a tapestry of gold and violet, they sat together on the porch, watching their child run through the garden, untroubled by the shadows of the past. The man took her hand, the same hand he had once held trembling in the hospital corridor years before, and felt the full weight and beauty of their journey. He realized then that the emptiness he had once carried was gone, replaced with a richness so profound it almost frightened him, a life that had been fragile, yet had grown resilient, tender, and unshakably real. In that moment, they did not speak, for words could not capture the depth of what they felt. But in their silence was gratitude, triumph, and an understanding that their story, full of pain, fear, and loss, had become a testament to the power of enduring love. They had learned that happiness is not a sudden, blinding joy, but a quiet, steady flame that burns brightest when tended with care, courage, and trust. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting its warm light over the home they had built, he pressed a gentle kiss to her temple and whispered, almost to himself, after everything, we found life. We found love. And it is ours, always. For the first time, he understood completely. They had survived the worst, embraced the hardest truths, and in doing so, they had discovered the ultimate gift, an ordinary, imperfect, but undeniably beautiful life together, filled with hope, laughter, and the enduring promise of tomorrow. Their story did not end with a flourish. It continued, infinitely, in every heartbeat, every glance, and every choice to love again. A life proof that even the deepest darkness could lead to the brightest light. That was the end of the story. Stay with me until we meet again.